Thanks, Craig. And thank you, Dr. Halpern, for joining us today and for presenting on a topic so important to our work here at GDCS. A little bit about Dr. Halpern. He's the director of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, or NCEAS, and professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. He got his Ph.D. in marine ecology from UC Santa Barbara and then held a joint postdoctoral fellowship at NCEAS and the Smith Fellowship Program. He was a research associate at NCEAS for the decade following that until joining the faculty at the Bren School. Dr. Halpern has published over 250 peer-reviewed articles and was named one of the world's most influential scientific minds by Thompson-Reuters. As many of us know, coastal marine ecosystems faced a host of pressures from both offshore and land-based human activity. So today we're thrilled to have Dr. Halpern here today to present results from his work assessing global human sewage inputs and their potential impacts on coastal ecosystems. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining. Apologies for my mix-up on the earlier time, and daylight savings time got me last time, but I'm really excited to be here and have the opportunity to share this work and then just meet folks and begin conversations and think about the future as well, because I'm sure there'll be lots of things we can talk about, pathways for collaborations, or at least sharing ideas moving forward. So I'm going to talk about this paper that just came out a few weeks ago, but I want to briefly set, and I really briefly set the context for where this came from and a little bit about my research and my approach to research that led me to do this project. So I got interested long ago in kind of thinking about the many different ways that human activities impact ocean ecosystems. This grew out of some initial interest in thinking about, well, persists to this day, about how do we best protect and manage ocean ecosystems, and focusing initially on marine protected areas as a key tool for doing that. But of course, MPAs only address some potential pressures to ocean ecosystems, and in particular, they are pretty ineffective at dealing with land-based sources of stress because they're a place-based protection in the ocean. But I really wanted to think about these many potential stressors and how they interact to create cumulative pressures for the oceans, and what that means for thinking about strategic intervention to mitigate those pressures and better protect ocean ecosystems. So it's very diverse. As we all know, there's many ways that we are affecting ocean ecosystems around the world. And this effort, which was very collaborative and a lot of work, led to this paper now, I guess, what, 13, 14 years ago, where we combined all those stressors, at the time, 17 different stressors, to get this map of cumulative impact of human activities on the oceans. And this was, I think, transformative, certainly for myself, in thinking about how we understand pressures and how we can address them, both compartmentalizing them, you know, land versus ocean, fishing versus climate. There's different ways that we can package this up to disaggregate and then reaggregate our understanding of how different sets of stressors are affecting the oceans, and thinking about the interactions among them. Of course, we don't all know the extent to which stressors interact in additive or synergistic or antagonistic ways, but addressing that and thinking about it is central to our understanding of how we are impacting the ocean. So we did this, and then we're like, wow, we got this, a bunch of data, what more can we do with it? And one of those things was to really think about areas where land-based pressures are having a big impact on ocean ecosystems. So this was one of our first efforts to try to disentangle this. So, you know, we had a lot of the pressures from land, from nutrient runoff to chemicals from pesticides to inorganic compounds from impervious surface in urban areas, as well as some of the direct human impacts just from coastal development and human use of coastal areas that collectively impact coastal ecosystems from the connection from watershed dynamics mostly into coastal waters. So we did all this modeling. What you see there in those light gray lines is the watersheds on the continents. And we could map and aggregate up all those pressures into the watersheds, and then from their pour points along the coast, plume them into coastal waters to see where they were having an impact on coastal ecosystems. That alone was a lot of work, but the previous work I just showed you allowed us to not only do that, but to think about the proportional or relative contribution of land-based impacts to other types of impacts. And so these hotspots you see here are different ways of measuring whether it's an absolute or a proportional, or so the colors represent different ways of measuring hotspots, but effectively they're pointing out areas where land-based sources of stress are having a dominant role in impacting coastal ecosystems. And many of them are unsurprising, the Mississippi, the Danube, the Yangtze, these really large, huge watersheds that aggregate all sorts of land-based pressures, of course, are having really big impact. But some of the other ones that are in the green and the blue are places where its other pressures are quite low, or lower anyway. And so the proportion is actually bigger than one might expect in our areas where land-based pressures may be off the radar because they're not the dominant huge watersheds, but their proportional consequence for coastal areas is quite large. So this is one of the first ways we started to think about how to address these connections and figure out where you want to prioritize land-based strategies for improving coastal ecosystem condition. Now, just one of those stressors from land-based is nitrogen. And there's long been interest in understanding the role of eutrophication in coastal ecosystems. And in coastal waters, there's basically three main sources of nitrogen that are affecting these areas. So there's agricultural runoff from fertilizer on crops or livestock manure, which is the one that has gotten the vast majority of attention and interest for understanding land-based impacts of nitrogen on coastal waters. Atmospheric deposition that comes from all sorts of sources, agriculture as well, but other human uses of the landscape that aerosolize nitrogen and then it gets deposited in coastal areas. And then wastewater. And although a lot of people have studied this and spoken to the contribution of wastewater nitrogen in coastal ecosystems, it gets surprisingly overlooked compared to agriculture in a lot of the literature. And I stumbled into this. I was one of those people that wasn't paying attention to it. I was really focused on the agricultural side of stuff. And in fact, that mapping work I showed you, we only looked at fertilizers. Later, we've added in livestock manure as well, but we just hadn't paid attention to wastewater because the literature doesn't speak to it. At least the literature I was reading about coastal conservation wasn't speaking to it. A lot of the wastewater literature is in the public health side of stuff, which makes a lot of sense. And it also motivates a really interesting intersection between human health and ecosystem health for coastal ecosystems through wastewater. And it was one of the motivating factors for getting interested in it. So I kind of stumbled into it and then realized what a large potential player it could be in understanding human impacts on land from land on coastal ecosystems. So I spent the last 2 years on some projects really diving into this and trying to better understand the sources and then the ultimate consequences of this wastewater input. So I don't know how much people know about it, so I'll start from the beginning because that's where I started just 2 years ago, knowing almost nothing about it. But there are basically three main sources of wastewater. One is the sewer systems with pretty built infrastructure, that lower left image that's mostly in developed countries, wealthy nations where you have the resources to build this kind of infrastructure. Septic systems, the upper left, which are common in developed countries. The US has lots and lots of septic systems. Hawaii has lots of septic systems, but they're common in a lot of other parts of the world as well. And then there's quite a lot of direct input into systems, whether they're literally outhouses like this or people just going out into the landscape or not in their backyard, defecating or urinating. And so these three main sources have different geographies of where they happen. And so better understanding those geographies helps us think about how nitrogen from wastewater gets put into the watersheds and then how that might propagate through those watersheds into coastal ecosystems. So we had 4 questions that really motivated our work in this paper, and I'll walk through each of them, and then we can talk about the implications of this. So the first is really just trying to understand how much wastewater nitrogen there is. So, what is the global contribution of wastewater nitrogen into coastal ecosystems? So there had been some accounting done from others, but we really wanted to get as accurate an accounting, in particular, understanding where it's coming from, not just how much. So that second part is then starting to disentangle the sources of wastewater from those 3 different types: sewer, septic, and direct input, and getting spatially explicit maps of that to start to think about the connection of where solutions on land might connect to solutions in coastal waters. And the third question is kind of the so what from a nature side. So, where and how much are coastal habitats exposed to these wastewater nitrogen inputs? We know many habitats like coral reefs and seagrass beds are very sensitive to eutrophication. So where are those places where those types of habitats are most exposed to wastewater nitrogen, to think about those connections between sensitive coastal habitats and sources of wastewater nitrogen. And then the final one is from the human health perspective. We spend less time on that in the paper, but it's really important intersection, as I mentioned before, of this huge literature on human health dimensions of wastewater because of the pathogens that are in wastewater, sewage, and environmental health that comes from nitrogen inputs. And I'll foreshadow some of the issues in that the mitigation strategies for pathogen removal from wastewater are different than the mitigation strategies, for the most part, for nitrogen. And so you have potential competing interests and strategies for dealing with the same problem, depending on what you care about more. And so the intersection of these is a really interesting policy and management space to think about. Okay, so how do we do this? It's a model. Models are only as good as the data that go into them. So we did the best we can, but there's always the caveats that, we have assumptions for how we deal with these data, and we know there are uncertainties and gaps in these data. So all those caveats aside, we wanted to produce a global model, high resolution, spatially explicit global model of where nitrogen is coming from in wastewater and where it's going. So obviously it's coming from humans. And so we have a map of humans on the planet, which there are many people who have been working on developing that. So we took some of the latest work on mapping where human populations are. And then we also have information about whether they're in urban or rural communities. And this is important because infrastructure tends to correlate pretty strongly with whether you're urban or rural in terms of sewer versus septic versus direct input. So we had data on that, and we could disaggregate the human populations based on the proportion or the percentage of the populations that are in rural versus urban settings. So we had a separate layer for urban and rural human populations. And then where all the nitrogen in wastewater comes from is primarily from protein consumption, well, nearly entirely from protein consumption. And there are very different ways that people eat around the world and the amount of protein they get. And so we wanted to account for both the relative differences in diets among different places and the conversion factor of that protein into urea and other nitrogen in human excrement. So once we calculate all that, we basically have the amount of nitrogen being put into the system by humans. And then we have the 3 different types of wastewater production from humans. So they're either going to the bathroom in a toilet, so that's in a sewer system, if it's connected to a sewer system, or in a toilet that's on a septic system, or just directly into the landscape. And so we have information on the percentage of populations at country or sometimes state levels that allow us to basically approximate how many of the people in any given pixel are likely on sewer, septic, or untreated systems. So we model that. For the septic and untreated systems, those are on the landscapes. And the interesting upside of that from a nitrogen perspective is nature can help us out here. So when nitrogen is put onto the landscape, plants and soils can trap and use some of that nitrogen and remove it from the system. And from the literature, it looks, like if these systems were more than about a kilometer away from a stream or a river, nature probably mostly took it up and removed it. Now that's hugely dependent on the type of soil and the type of vegetation, which we did not model globally because that's an enormous undertaking. So obviously, if you were to zoom into a place like Hawaii, where the soil is not really soil, it's all this like volcanic stuff that's porous and doesn't trap much nitrogen at all, this would be a poor assumption to use. But in general, nature helps mitigate nitrogen input from septic and untreated systems if they are more than about a kilometer away from water. And so I got ahead of myself. So we have maps of all of the streams and rivers that we spatialized, and then could determine any area that was within 1 kilometer of those waterways would have nitrogen make it into the water system and eventually into the coastal waters. That's, I guess, actually, that is what's all in there. So we have, we count for all of those types of sewer, septic, and untreated systems that differ by urban and rural. We calculate that up, we measure the distance from the stream and river, and then anything that falls within that 1 kilometer band gets aggregated up into a watershed. So we sum up the total amount of nitrogen from these 3 different sources as they flow through the watershed. I forgot to mention sewer systems are built to basically aggregate and pipe all of the wastewater directly into rivers or into coastal waters, which I'll foreshadow, that's an interesting management challenge there. So anything on sewer was 100% put into the watershed system. And then we track both nitrogen in this and fecal indicator organisms, which are indicators of the pathogens that are in the water, so that we can track eutrophication and the pathogen input separately to think about this human health and ecosystem health difference. So all that gets aggregated to these pour points that are on coastal waters. And then we use it, as we've done in the past, a simple diffusion model to spread it into coastal waters. Now we know there's all sorts of crazy coastal circulation patterns and advection that move things in very different ways that are not diffusive. But we've done some ground truthing that says on average, it's not a bad approximation of what happens across a year as seasons shift the movement of water and storms happen and stuff like that. So hugely imperfect, but not a terrible approximation of where nitrogen is likely to occur. Higher resolution, local scale assessment, we probably want to deal with more advection and coastal dynamics to get a better estimate of that. And then that allows us to measure the total exposure of any particular coastal pixel or habitat within the coastal areas to that nitrogen or those fecal indicator organisms. So that's our methodology. Obviously tons under the hood there of this spatial data and modeling, and I'm happy to dive into that whenever you want, if you want, but I'll focus on those first 4 questions and the results we have from them. So as others have found, we also found, so it's a confirming result, but based on very different methods, that about the wastewater nitrogen is about 40% of the nitrogen that comes from fertilizer and livestock manure, so nearly half as much. Again, remember, vast majority of attention is focused on nitrogen from agriculture as the source of eutrophication in coastal waters. Wastewater gets a tiny percentage of that fraction, and yet it's nearly half as much of the nitrogen. So it's a major, major source of nitrogen in coastal waters. And just to get a sense of the distribution of that, this is the map of on land where it's coming from, and in the coastal waters where it's ending up. If we can zoom in and see some of these plumes that show different rivers, the Danube, the one in Bangladesh, I'm blanking on its name right now, and the Yangtze. So these are 3 major, huge watersheds, and you get these substantial plumes that come out of them into coastal waters. But so it's not only a lot, but it's, of course, as one would expect, spatially heterogeneous, very much so, based on where the large watersheds are and where human populations are concentrated. And what we found is that just top 25 watersheds contribute about half of all of global wastewater nitrogen. Again, these are the very large ones, so it's not a terribly surprising result, but it's a really important one that speaks to something that a lot of people who focus only on land-based conservation or only on ocean-based conservation overlook a lot, that what happens on land gets hyper-concentrated into a few places because of these very, very large watersheds that something like the top 200 watersheds cover something like 90% of all of the Earth's surface on land, or I don't know the exact number, but it's a lot, right? And so you can get these high concentrations of land-based activities in the coastal areas, and this is happening also with wastewater. But because we've done all this mapping, we can really start to dig into country level differences. So the three colors here are treated or sewered system in pink, the septic systems in that beige color, and open defecation in the purple color. So not surprisingly, some of the largest countries in the world with the most number of people, China, India, United States, Brazil, Mexico, these are really large populations, are also the ones with the largest total amount of wastewater nitrogen. But you can see really big differences in the proportion coming from different types of wastewater. So in China, it's maybe about a third of it is open defecation. In India, close to half. In the United States, it's a tiny percent, not a tiny, but it's like maybe less than 5% of it is coming from direct input. Whereas in the United States, we're nearly all on a sewerage system, same with Mexico and Egypt. So you can see across countries, very different proportions that are coming from these three different sources. And that speaks, of course, to the need for different strategies for mitigating wastewater nitrogen input into watersheds and ultimately coastal ecosystems. Then we can look at this for all countries. The Netherlands is repeated in both, so you can see how the spiral diagram connects to the one that's stacked. So everything in the spiral diagram is much smaller than what's on the stacked bars there, but you can see really profound differences by continent that, again, are not terribly surprising because they're highly connected to the development status of a lot of these, or the economic status of a lot of these countries. As those results showed and began to hint at, septic and direct input is a really big part of what's happening in the planet. And globally, about 40% of wastewater nitrogen comes from those two sources. The other 60% is on sewage systems. So in order to get a handle on wastewater, you really have to be thinking about strategies to deal with septic and direct input. And a lot of people focus on trying to convert that to sewage systems so that you have the infrastructure to aggregate and treat that nitrogen. But that may not always be the right solution depending on what you're trying to achieve. In many countries, as you saw, it's nearly 100% is coming from septic and direct input. So now we get, what does this mean for ecosystems? So like I said, we plumed this out into coastal waters. And for coral reefs, you can see, well, it's not stated here, but something like 65 to 70% of all coral reefs are exposed to wastewater nitrogen. Again, this is with a diffusive model, so there might be more than that in some areas when nitrogen gets advected further along the coastline, but it's a lot. There are places that are not exposed. For example, a lot of the Great Barrier Reef and the outer areas aren't being exposed to a lot of wastewater nitrogen. The inside reefs certainly are. And then you can see with the orange dots where some of the highest impact places are. And these, are concentrated around high population areas, but also areas where coral reefs are right up against coastal watershed pour points. And this is an interesting difference from that result I spoke to about the top 25 watersheds having 50% of the wastewater nitrogen. because coral reefs tend to not be in front of large watersheds for all sorts of reasons. There's a lot of freshwater input, a lot of sediment input. It's really hard for coral reefs to live in front of very large watersheds. So most of them are in front of small watersheds. And this really speaks to the importance of not just paying attention to the large watersheds, which a lot of the past work has done, but to really pay attention to the small coastal watersheds, especially in tropical areas where coral reefs and seagrasses are tightly connected to them. So these orange dots really show where those connections are really likely strong, and coral reefs are feeling a lot of impact from wastewater nitrogen input from those often small but really important coastal watersheds. Similar but larger results for seagrass, just they're more globally distributed because they can exist in temperate and subarctic regions as well. So more like 88% of seagrasses are exposed to wastewater input. But similar results you're seeing here of areas, lots of areas that are being impacted, some that are not experiencing any modeled exposure to wastewater nitrogen, and then the orange dots much more clustered around temperate population areas in Europe, Americas, and Asia, where there's lots of human population and seagrass beds. So you start to see these spatial patterns of where coastal habitats are being exposed to and potentially impacted by wastewater nitrogen. Here are the numbers. Okay, so 58% of coral reefs and 88% of seagrasses from these modeled results. And then the last set of results from this paper are focused on the fecal indicator organisms. And what we wanted to do here is really focus, we have the results that show the plumed models for pathogen input as well, but we wanted to focus on where fecal indicator organisms are much higher or much lower than nitrogen, because where the two inputs deviate a lot suggests the need for paying attention to different strategies for dealing with nitrogen versus pathogens. So pathogens are really well dealt with by sewer systems when the infrastructure is actually functioning, which isn't always the case, but that's what they're designed for. The primary reason we build sewer infrastructure is to gather largely the poo from water to remove the pathogens from that before letting the gray water out of the system and into waterways and the coastal areas. And so sewer systems are largely, when functioning, really effective at removing pathogens, but they're not designed for dealing with nitrogen at all until you get to like tertiary or beyond sewer infrastructure, which is really rare because it's very expensive to remove nitrogen from water. And so only the most advanced economic countries have the resources to build tertiary infrastructure to remove nitrogen. Whereas, like I said earlier, nature is a really good system for removing nitrogen. So for septic and direct input, you can actually use nature to your benefit to filter that out, but it's not very good at dealing with pathogens. So they tend to still go through the system and make it into waterways. And so you have this really potentially big difference in how to deal with wastewater, depending on what your objective is, whether it's human health or ecosystem health. And where, like in the blue areas, you have really high fecal indicator organism input, but much lower nitrogen. These are places where sewage systems are a good strategy for dealing with wastewater because it's not as much of a concern around nitrogen, but there is a big concern around pathogen input. And where you have really high nitrogen, but not much pathogen, the redder areas, which isn't quite accurate. I mean, obviously the Mississippi has lots of pathogens, but it's a huge input of nitrogen from fertilizer and agriculture, as well as wastewater. The strategies need to be thinking about nitrogen mitigation, and if that's using green infrastructure instead of sewage systems or other strategies that can help remove nitrogen, those are the kinds of places that would work well. Where they're even, it is really, you may have to think about both strategies or just acknowledge that you may be, for example, with sewage systems, you are helping remove pathogens, but you are aggregating and hyper concentrating nitrogen into where the sewer pours into the waterway or into the coastal waters. So you can actually be solving one problem and making the other much, much worse. So there's this tension between solutions that arises with trying to figure out how to deal with the two types of outcomes from wastewater. Which is that point. I just want to end with some work that we're starting to incorporate into this broader modeling approach of thinking about nitrogen input into coastal waters. So this work is in review. We're trying to get a much better assessment of nitrogen from livestock as well as agriculture from fertilizer. The project is to actually look at the global environmental footprint from all food production on land and in the sea, and think about the 4 types of major pressures that come from food production, from greenhouse gas emissions, the disturbance of the place, the use of fresh water, and then nitrogen and phosphorus input. So in the scope of this talk here, just pointing out that we have developed much better spatial maps of nitrogen input, not just from fertilizer that's now very crop specific for all the different land uses and crop production around the world, as well as from livestock manure, which is a major source of nitrogen around the world. And so we now have, we think, pretty good models of agriculture, fertilizer, livestock manure, and wastewater. So 2 of the 3 major sources of coastal nitrogen input, to really understand the connection of land-based nitrogen input into coastal waters. So happy to leverage this and think about other things one could do with kind of thinking about land-sea connections with nitrogen in particular from these different sources. So I'll end there with a rosy view of a sewer pipe pumping into the coastal waters. I wanted to keep it relatively short to leave lots of time for discussion, because I find that much more rewarding and fun than hearing me just talk on and on. But I hope that was helpful, and look forward to questions and discussions. So thank you.
That was great. Yeah, there's clapping, going on. I'm sure there are going to be questions. I want to kick off a question if I could. And it just kind of came up in the back of my mind near the end. With this work, is the resolution of it, not just spatial, but kind of information resolution of the work, is it positioned well to say help states in the US, given that we're going to dole out a bunch of infrastructure money across the United States in the next year? Is that the state of the science, or is it not ready? It's not really ready to interject that level of detail into the decision-making process on how you'd spend $1 trillion, say.
Yeah, on one level it is. So like I said, the information that goes into the models it's mixed resolution. So like we have information on, the distribution of populations to the 1 minute resolution, and we have land use at the 30 meter resolution, or I can't remember. So it's mixed resolution, but definitely sub-state, sub-county even, really. There are other things about the proportion of population that's on sewage systems that at this global model, we use national level statistics to model that. So yes, the information is could be used for that, but I can imagine that anyone wanting to dole out $1 trillion or $1 billion or whatever would want to have the best available science at a given state level. So the models are all set up there, but my guess is you'd want to crank through local or state level data to update the information that's feeding into it, which would not be hard because the code's all there and it's freely available. It's just you would need to gather the data and crank through it. So it could very well be very useful to that, but it would take a little bit of work. My guess, I can't imagine state of California being happy with a global level assessment for the state. They'd want to know what happened in California before they made decisions about allocating resources.
And so I guess my follow-up question, and then I'll give it to the next person, is are people knocking on your door? I would think that the door knocks would be accumulating, given how important this is.
Not yet, I guess, because it's just 2 weeks old, maybe, or maybe I'm not doing a good job promoting its existence. But yeah, I mean, I think it is. I have been talking a lot with the World Bank. They're very interested in this. It's a perfect fit for that level. The type of analysis and the approach is a perfect fit for them as they think about investing. You know, they've long had a program in investing in wastewater infrastructure, primarily to deal with the pathogen side of stuff, and they're getting more interested in the ecosystem health side of stuff. And so the folks there are really keen to think about how and where to invest World Bank funding to build up infrastructure that solves problems rather than exacerbates them. So this idea, like if you shift things to sewage systems, you solve one problem, but you could create a whole bunch of other ones. And so they're paying a lot of attention to this. I haven't yet got any door knocks from US infrastructure bill, but maybe that'll come.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
If people have questions, use the reaction. I think you can raise your hand and you'll be able to speak.
Yue? Is that how you say your name?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really excellent talk and I learned a lot. And I have two questions. The first one, in your model, which level of watershed boundary you use? It's because we all know the watershed has different level. And in the second one, some watershed is really huge. So did you consider the nitrogen loss during transportation from long distance from land to the rivers and to the oceans? And how did you adjust that? Thank you so much.
Yeah. So the watershed layer, it's a derivative of hydroshed stuff. We developed it for our original work before hydrosheds had done a good enough watershed layer. For example, any of you familiar with the coast along Santa Barbara, all of the mountain range facing the coast where Santa Barbara is in the earlier versions of hydroshed actually were aggregated into the watershed on the other side of the mountain. So everything that happened in Santa Barbara went up over the mountain and down into a different river, which obviously doesn't happen. And this is a problem all over the world. These small coastal watersheds hadn't been well modeled in the global watershed data layer. So we developed our own at a very high resolution. I think since then, the hydrosheds have improved their data layer and they have, like you said, those tiers. Ours, we model it ultimately at a 1 square kilometer resolution. So it's not any finer resolution than that. The reason we've stuck with ours rather than switching to something else that might be better is we also spent a huge amount of time figuring out where the pour points are. So this is to the theme of what this seminar series is about. People don't pay attention to the connection between land and sea. So no one ever really bothered to figure out where the pour points are because they're like, well, we'll model stuff in the watershed and then we're done. It's like, well, where does it go into coastal areas? So we actually hand calibrated by scanning the entire world's coastlines with Google Earth and marking where the pour points are for every single stream and river. It took an unbelievable amount of time. So we have a global layer of these pour points too that are connected to our watersheds through the ID tags that link them. So if we were to switch to a new watershed layer, we'd have to redo that, and I don't want to redo that. Anyway, that's a bit of a story about why we have the watershed layer we use. To your second question, no, we didn't do that. We're well aware of that. There's all sorts of watershed processes that we know are important for uptake of nitrogen. The vegetation cover, the soil type, the slope, in the water, freshwater, biology that takes up nitrogen, that all will remove nitrogen as it flows down the river into the coastal areas. We just didn't have the bandwidth to model all that at a global scale, but those are the kinds of things, if you were to do a study on a single watershed, for example, would be clearly important to include and could be included. We didn't include it in our assessment.
Nick,
A similar kind of data source kind of question is, how are we able to come up with different, I guess maybe ratios of septic and sewage and direct deposit kind of data for each watershed around the world?
Yeah, they are reported through, I think it's World Health Organization or FAO. I think it must be World Health Organization for each country. So they're country level statistics that we then can additionally modify by that rural versus urban population factor. So it's modeled. So to say, like, in this watershed, we know exactly this percentage in this specific location of where a septic system is not the case. It's an approximation, but it's saying, okay, we know where the people are, we know whether they're urban or rural, and we know the percentage of the population across that country that is on sewer, septic, or direct input. And we distribute that basically equally across those different rural versus urban communities. And that then has it land within a watershed. So obviously, if there are factors that influence, populations in one part of a country that's rural to be more or less septic versus direct than another part, we wouldn't capture that. So we would have error in our estimates from that for sure. There's always this trade-off in global modeling about what factors to include and what to exclude. And some of it is an art and some of it is a scientific judgment, and some of it you get wrong. But you try to capture what you think are the most important variables. And then you have to let go of others. Otherwise you'll just, spend an eternity trying to capture every single detail, which is just not possible. Paulina?
kind of related actually, and Ji-Wei, your answer to Ji-Wei's question made me think of this. If you had more time and resources to either improve or augment or add in more models that of additional layers, like what would your priorities be for making it either more detailed or more accurate or something like that?
Yeah. So I actually forgot to mention that we have just finished a regional case study for the Mesoamerican Reef, so Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula area, where we folded in the livestock and agriculture layers as well, so that we can more directly assess the percent contribution of wastewater versus this other major source of nitrogen into coastal waters, to think about, okay, if you're trying to deal with nitrogen input, what do you deal with? Wastewater, livestock, agriculture, or all three? But we also dealt with tourism and seasonality in that area. So obviously tourism is a huge deal. And it's, I think, a really interesting dimension of this that almost always gets overlooked is you've got migrant populations, in this case tourists, that come in. They tend to eat a lot of protein and in concentrated areas around hotels or tourist sites, and then they leave, and they just don't get measured in any of these estimates because they're focused on resident populations from the population data of where people are resident. And so in coastal California and Hawaii and Belize, like, tourist populations represent a huge percentage of the total number of people that are in a place that gets ignored. And then of course there's a seasonal dimension to that, especially in places like Belize, where people come in certain seasons and they're not there in others. And so thinking about that seasonality and when rain happens, because that's a major driver of the input. So we truly tried to capture that month-to-month seasonality of human presence and the potential for nitrogen being washed through ecosystems. So I guess the answer to your question is it kind of depends on the scale of assessment. So like at a local or regional scale like that, I think those kinds of things become really important, as well as better coastal circulation models, because, you know, especially, and we weren't able to do it in that project that I was just mentioning, but really getting good models or even empirical data on how coastal water is distributed will get a much better estimate of which reefs, which seagrasses, which habitats are actually being exposed to wastewater nitrogen. At a global scale, I'm guessing the next best, besides just improving the quality of the data that we were using, the next best thing would be some information about the landscape, whether it's soil type, slope, or vegetation. Like some combination of those is really important for better understanding if or how nitrogen is absorbed by nature versus put to the system. It's just, you know, it's enormously variable across the planet, right? And so it's really daunting to do at a global scale, all of that. But slope is doable relatively easily, but soil type and vegetation gets complicated really fast. But those would, my guess, those would improve the model substantially if you could get a handle on it.
Thanks. Mary?
Hi, Ben. Thanks so much for the talk. Good to see you. This is super exciting. You know, capturing this type of data at this scale, I mean, I just thought that was never possible. So thanks for your hard work, you and your team. We've been thinking about how these kind of spatial proxies of the relative inputs of land-based pollution can be related back to like the concrete metrics that can be used for management targets. And so like some level of ground truthing is necessary, calibration at least to like the relative patterns we're representing in the maps versus like the actual monitoring for like water quality. And one way we've done that in French Polynesia is with looking at algae and calculating. You probably know of this work. It's with Darren Bricky-Pyle, but and looking at the stable isotopes in the algae. And there was some decent correlation with for the scale of like a tiny little island, Moorea. We've also been working on that in Hawaii and using kind of the spatial layers of sewage input we had from ocean tipping points. And there's like less correlation. So I guess I'm just curious, like to what extent at the global scale, like this type of calibration might be helpful, or have you done it? And yeah, just kind of general comments on that.
Yeah. It's a great line of inquiry. And one of the things that ended up being surprising and powerful about that 2008 study I showed at the very beginning, where we mapped the cumulative impacts, was we actually were able to use independent data to effectively ground truth the modeling we had done to show that the cumulative impact metric index we came up with was pretty well correlated with the condition of coral reef ecosystems around the world. And so instead of having it be a model of likely impact, we could actually say it was a model of probable impact. And so that kind of ground truthing is, in my mind, transformative to the power of these models. Like the models are great heuristics for thinking about where you might want to act, or, you know, the kind of the bigger picture. But if you can ground truth them, they just, you know, become powerfully predictive on where different types of strategies or different actions need to be taken. And so one of the things the folks in the Mesoamerican Reef are going to do, they have a whole bunch of monitoring projects just starting up from funding from other projects, and they're going to use our model output to see if or how well, you know, our predictions match what they're seeing in the water. And if they don't, okay, we got our models wrong, and we'll go back and try to fix them. But if they do, it becomes super powerful. So I think, yeah, the more that that's possible, the better, for sure. And I think what you're finding in Moorea is super exciting when it doesn't work in places like Hawaii, it like makes you think, well, why? And then you start to ask questions in a different way, or change the models because you know that Hawaii ecosystems are different because of X, Y, and Z. And so I think it's a really, really fruitful strategy for research.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. That's interesting. We find a relationship with the status of the reef in Hawaii, but not with the indicator algae. So maybe it's the algae data, but anyway, more to think about. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, I'll just end then reminding folks that it's all freely available, our code and our data for this. So please use it freely. But I'm also, if there's opportunities to think about collaborations, it's always fun too. It's part of what Greg and I started talking about, I don't know, a year or two ago at this point. So excited to think about ways that this can be used either on its own, whatever you want to do with it, or together. So I'm happy to stay in touch. And if you can't find what you're looking for, just be in touch and I can point you to the code or the data.
I just want to say thank you, Ben, for joining us. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your leadership in this space. It's totally pathfinding and gives us compass. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks again for the invitation.